in the topic. And this topic is always a bit of a challenge for me. If we look at modern society, my experience has been that for young people, meaning those up to like 40, everything becomes relative when you become an elder. So up till 40, I consider young. And my experience with most people up to that age is they don't identify with death at all. And they look at life as a continuing path of future events. And my experience is they see themselves as young always. This is their identity. Young, active, and in the world. And then they look at older folks and they shake their head in sadness and think, oh, they're old. And that's their identity. And so it's kind of this fixed way of seeing the world. Then, as we do become older, suddenly it seems important to at least think of one's mortality. And especially with the baby boomers that I'm identified with, on American TV, just about every other advertisement is focusing on some medication for some part of your body. And they go into all kinds of details. So whether we want to deal with death or not, it's constantly in our face and all the possible things that can go wrong. And just as the baby boomers have sort of dictated a lot of what American and I guess European society culture looks like. So there seems to be, in America at least, a real anxiety and angst, a depression about the future. Now, there's enough going on in the world today to be specific and worry about financial problems, or ecology, or warfare. But I've always felt that maybe an underlying foundation to that is one's slowly accepting awareness that they're getting older and death is around the corner.
Judith, Mиллер, да. Значит, но я думаю, что, может быть, вот основанием всего этого кризиса является вот это беспокойство о старении поколения.
You kind of question, why should death be a problem at all? Because, in fact, all of our spiritual traditions, the mystical, Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, the Christian mystics, certainly the Eastern spiritual traditions, tell us that there's nothing to worry about. That death is going to be great. And as a transpersonal psychotherapist myself, I kind of tell that to my clients too. I say, just have another ego death and you're really preparing yourself. So the more ego deaths you have, when it comes to that final moment, it'll be great. And, you know, we have a story, I'm sure many of you are familiar, it's the Eastern spiritual guru or teacher is lying on his or her deathbed with a peaceful smile and eyes closed, just waiting for that moment, which is no more than just another ego death. It's no big deal. And he's ready. So we in the transpersonal field know all this. However, my experience with my own process and with my clients, when it comes to our many ego deaths that continually keep coming around, in spite of all the assurance, I have found for myself and for the people I work with that there's a very high degree of anxiety. And so each time a new ego death comes, there is a panic because it feels like an annihilation again and another death. So one of the things, the terms that I don't know German, I work in Germany a lot, but one of the things that I learned from my German friends is they have a term called red line. Do you know, is that European or is that just German? Red line?
Red line in German or in English?
Well, what they mean by a red line is that there's a theme or a topic that goes through a person's life. Okay, is that red? Yeah, just a major, I think Jung would call it a complex. But so the idea is that we all have our respective complexes or red lines. So as I was trying to prepare this presentation, which has gone through a number of changes, I have to admit, I became aware, I think for the first time, that my red line is dead. Therefore, this presentation is another one of my ego deaths, as I'm conveying it. But I thought I'd like to start and tell you why this death has been not only informed my spiritual path, but the various ways that it's manifested in my life. And it actually began at age 16. And no one in my life had died. There would have been no reason for this to come up, but it came up in such a strong way. And I remember feeling, how in the world can anybody that reaches middle age or above, how can they live and be happy knowing that the years they have left are probably much less than the years that they've lived, and then they're going to die, and then they're going to go into the ground, and then they're going to become ashes. And it suddenly came for me such an existential anxiety. And I've always been sort of dramatic about things, so I went through a period, my artist phase, and I remember I would draw these abstract paintings, paint them of death. And there's one painting I remember, it was a black background, and then I used a palette knife with purple, and I went through it, and then I hung it up over my bed. And I looked at it and I felt it, and I guess I was really depressed. But it didn't last all that long, because then some new event happened in my life and I went on whatever my life was. But I knew at the time that this whole issue of death anxiety was major for me. And it just got repressed, but it didn't really go away. And so then my life kept going, and I got married, and I had some kids, and then I went back into a PhD program in psychology. And all I knew when I was doing that is that my dissertation was going to be on death anxiety. I was hoping that somehow I could work it out through this process. I'd find the answer, and it would be okay. Well, this was 1980, and believe it or not, in 1980, the whole topic of death in America was very, very anxiety-provoking. Death and sex, you didn't deal with, particularly in the psychology department. So it took quite a bit for me, and it was really important to me that this happened. So I talked my advisor into doing it, and to make the long story short, I didn't find my answer through the dissertation. Rather, I had to give psychological. I did not find my answer. No. I was told that we had to give surveys to different groups. One was a death anxiety survey. And my hypothesis at the time going in was the way a person incorporates his or her own mortality is going to affect the way the person lives their life. And I somehow thought the person will be more risk-taking and more fully active in life if they've accepted their death. That's what I thought. And so we found two testing scales to give to different groups of graduate students. One testing scale was a death anxiety scale that someone had made up. And another one we figured out would be sensation seeking. Do you know what sensation seeking is? It's sort of risk-taking, wild behavior, that kind of thing. So we gave these two scales to medical students, males and females, clergy, those in the seminary, males and females, law students, and I think accounting students. And the results, the grand results were, guess who had the highest death anxiety of all? Medical students.
Who?
Medical students. So, and then the second group was the clergy. So it's almost, you know, you could make a case that doctors go into the field of medicine to control death, and then the clergy go in to control death somehow, to tell you how to deal with it. So that was interesting, but clearly my angst and my anxiety were not dealt with at all.
Judy, they have low or
high death anxiety. And the doctors and the religious people.
Religious people.
Right. Okay, so then at this time in my life, I started to have spontaneous spiritual mystical experiences. They just started happening. At the same time, my work was with schizophrenics and psychotics. And so a lot of my experiences of expanded consciousness were very similar to the delusions and the hallucinations of my psychotic clients. And I really couldn't go to my advisors to tell them about this, because that would have been a problem. So I was clearly on a journey of my own, that I had no preparation from, I had no support from, I had lots of ego deaths around it, but I feel in retrospect that there was a guidance that was coming, because I would have experiences and then suddenly a book would appear and to describe it. And there was no New Age movement there then really, and in the eastern part of America. So it was my own private journey as I was also trying to live my life. One of the supportive things that happened to me then is that I got involved with a group near-death experiencers, and I discovered, much to my surprise, that people who had near-death experiences were also having similar experiences to me. But the question in my mind was, but they died to have them. And so, why am I having them when I haven't died, and I don't think I'm a schizophrenic? So how come all these experiences seem very similar, and what does it all mean? But I had real ambivalence about what was happening to me then. And because of that, my activities with the near-death experience group was really as Dr. Miller, who would interview these experiencers, hear what they said, but I would never divulge my own. But it was a feeling of support and surprise. But it raised the question again about death. And it felt like another ego death, and my world started shifting more and more. So then I finished the training and I started doing facilitating breath work on my own. My ego deaths continued, and now I was working with lots of clients that were having ego deaths. So the idea of death, I'm trying to say, just was always there. And then about 12 years ago, I started working with Ingo Jarsets in Germany. And so our work began with the idea of holding summer retreats. And the question that we asked, what would it be like to do this deep work with people with a German facilitator and a Jewish co-facilitator together, the whole German-Jewish energy. So our work is a whole story how it happened, but I won't go into this now. Very interesting. We took a pilgrimage to Auschwitz to see if we were going to do this with 12 other people. But anyway, doing this work with Ingo, and now my work has become even more because we've been doing a 3-year transpersonal training group, the breathwork group that's just coming to an end. So I come to Germany 3 times a year, and over the years, it's many hundreds of people, primarily Germans, that are going through these very, very deep ego deaths. And as they go through these deep parts of their consciousness and their collective unconscious, they clearly come in touch with their ancestors, you know, from World War II, and those who were identified with Nazis. And so all this energy comes out. It's been an amazing experience for me because as a Jewish person, even though I had no personal connection to the Holocaust, it has really taken me into that energy, which is the death of my people, so many of them. And so that's been another major death for me over the years. As part of my own process, I've also experienced an ego death in terms of my Jewish identity, because not only have I found myself supporting and working with ancestors of Nazis in a healing way, my own process has also taken me into very strong mystical experiences of Christ consciousness. And so for a Jewish person, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there are two things that are real problematic. One is Hitler and the Germans, at least for American Jews. Two is Jesus Christ, because, many Jews feel that it's because of him, even though he was a rabbi, in fact, because of him that all this anti-Semitism exists. So here I have been at the core of myself with the Nazis and with Jesus. So this has been a real big ego death for me. And actually, related to that, in the training that I had with Stan Groff, one of the things he did in the training was to invite Rick Tarnas to come. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a well-known astrologer, and he relates it to the transpersonal ideology. And one of his big projects at the time was to look at people's processes, experiences, and make some connection or relationship to some famous person or event that happens in historical time. And so what he did in our training at that time, he said that we would have our breathwork experience. And then for some of us, after we had our breathwork experience, he would do research to find out, was anything going on of significance when you were doing the breathing. So for me, on that particular day, I found myself on the cross. And I was, in fact, identified with Jesus. And so I was on the cross. And then Rick came and he told me, he said, from his findings on planetary influences, that's the exact time that Jesus was on the cross. So that made an impact for me. And so the whole theme of crucifixion and resurrection, at least for me, it felt like, okay, that's coming from a really deep part of myself. The last event that I just want to tell you in terms of my red line of death, it's actually pretty present, and it has to do with my life and my husband Marty, who for some strange reason loves to travel around the world to all these strange, difficult little places and travel on our own, just the two of us. So, we find ourselves renting a car and driving through Africa with no place that we're going, and just all kinds of what to me have felt like very scary places. And the last trip that we made in May was to Uzbekistan. I mean, on the American advisory, that's one of the two places in the world that Americans are not supposed to go. I think because it's near Pakistan or Afghanistan. So we went. And so the question is, well, why are you going? Why are you following him to these weird places? And because I go into a complete death mode before every one of these trips, that this is really going to be it. The reason I go, he brings it up, I say no. He continues to do research on it, and I go. And because there's a part of me that feels, if this comes up, then I need to go. It's part of my journey. And so far, I've come back, and Uzbekistan was great. They usually are great. But the truth is, each time I go through a whole thing. This is going to be it. This is going to be my death. So, I'm going to stop with my red line. But can you see, and there are many other stories, can you see why this would be a theme in my life for a long time? Now, the Eastern traditions tell us that when we contemplate and have deep reflections on our own deaths, this will make a real change in the depths of your heart. So they tell us that contemplation of your death is really important. So I thought this morning, since you're coming here, let me try to work with you around this a little bit. And so I'd like to ask you now that we'll get into a situation where you can think, not think, but just be aware of some of your processes and your feelings around your own death. So I'd like you now, and this will be just for a few moments, to close your eyes. Where we live in the next world is entirely dependent upon our quality of life in this one. And according to Kabbalah's teaching, we learn and grow in the afterlife with like-minded souls. So in other words, we would probably hang out in transpersonal conferences, good or bad. And then Jewish mysticism has long taught that each soul must return to earth through cycles of rebirth in order to fulfill its particular purpose. And there is a word for that. It's called tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N. It says that each of us on earth has a special mission to carry out for God. And so, when you have successfully carried out your mission, then you can leave the earth permanently for a higher realm. And so, for Kabbalists, the quality of our consciousness during the moment of death determines which doorway will open for us after we leave our physical body. Now,